What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another Sons of Land episode. This is episode 3, and it'll be part 1 of a 3-part series. And I got my good friend and next door neighbor, Clay Badalak, with me.
Up, guys.
So, but yeah, we decided on this one that we wanted to go over Sermon on the Mount, but it's a lot to unpack. So, Matthew 5 will be this week, Matthew 6 next week, and Matthew 7, the end of Sermon on the Mount, will be the week after that. So, it's a 3-part series. So, stay tuned, but again, we're just two guys just trying to unpack this, just like you guys are, and digging into the word. So, without further ado, we'll get started. But yeah, it starts out. This is one of his most prolific sermons that he gives to the crowd, and it's just awesome because we kind of get to experience this with in Matthew and to start off the Gospels pretty much in Matthew 5. So, but just to start off, in verse 1, it says that one day he saw crowds gathering. Jesus went up on the mountainside and sat down. And I guess is that thing that sometimes he needs silent time with the Lord, but we're called to go spread the good news of Jesus to all that we can, right? And as Jesus tells us in the Great Commission in Matthew 28, it's just that's what we're called to do. So, and that's what Jesus did. He saw crowds and he was tired, just like we're tired, and he got after it. So, but yeah,
Yeah, I think the image that Matthew's kind of painting here is like Jesus is going on a mountain and he's basically given all these people a new law, and he's essentially given them the fulfillment of the law, and he's kind of acting as like a new Moses, because Moses went up a mountain and came down with the new law, came down with the 10 Commandments, and so yeah, he's just given them new law, and he makes a point. He says, I did not come to abolish the law or the prophets, but he came to fulfill them.
yeah, and I think that's a good way. I never thought of it like that, and how you put that with Moses and how he gets up on there on the mountaintop like that. Because, like you said, Moses was up on Mount Sinai all the time, especially like in Exodus and Leviticus, talking about that. But um, you know, when you look at the Beatitudes too, even before you're looking at the law, it's like I feel like it's kind of a lot to everything. For one, starts off with God blesses, or those are blessed by God, and I think that he begins his sermon with these are all the characteristics of those that are blessed by God, right? And I think that the biggest thing that sticks out to me is how like this is kind of a framework on how to live and how to act, and like you said, kind of a law, a different kind of law. And the biggest thing that sticks out is he shows the contrast, I think, in living through him and living for the world. Just in these things, God blesses those who are poor and realize their need for him, right? Like in the world you're told to, put on this face and not act poor, right? Not mourn. And it goes all these things, kind of, be merciful. And I feel like it's really he starts it off by saying, like, yes, the world's gonna like tells you all these things, but like God blesses those who are poor in spirit, right? And I think it kind of shows that, um, like he says, those who realize they need him. I think that that's like one of the biggest things in all of Matthew 5 3 to 12 for
Mm-hmm.
me is he he says like real those who realize their need for him. I
Yeah,
think that's the biggest thing is all these things come when you realize that you can't do this stuff on your own.
yeah. And kind of what I pulled out of my notes is I kind of looked at the second half of each beatitude on its own. Like the blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, because they will see God. Kind of like the second part of that, because they will see God. I think the second half of each beatitude, the answer to all of the problems we face is God. Um, so we need to like just let God be the one who changes your heart, heals you when you're hurt or in need of healing, and kind of just don't turn to the world, turn to God instead, because only He can give you the kingdom of heaven. Only He can make you pure in heart. He gives you mercy. He gives you righteousness when you are hungry. So I think just the answer to all the Beatitudes is just to turn to God and praise Him.
Yeah, I agree. Because like you said, it's all these things end with like God will give you these things, right? And it's that reward that God gives. And I think it's when we deny ourselves and realize that we need a savior and do all these things, become poor and, you know, be okay to like mourn and, know you're going to be persecuted, all these things, then that's when we're lifted up, right?
Yeah,
Um, and you can really take a long time on all of these, but I think one thing that I want to talk about is like humility and like being humble. Because I think especially me and you as athletes and just in this world as well, I think that now more than ever, like promoting yourself is something that you kind of have to do, but there's different ways to go about it. And I
sure.
feel like nowadays it says right here in verse 5, God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the whole earth. And in Mark 9:35, it says, when all the disciples are arguing over who's the greatest disciple, and all these things, and Jesus says, for you to be the greatest, you have to become the least. And then in heaven, you'll become the highest after that. And I think it's that same thing here as Jesus is telling all these people about being humble. It's just you gotta you gotta become a nobody, right? There's a great song by Casting Crowns, which by the way, there's an Apple Music playlist that me and him have put together, and we update it constantly. That you should check out. It's a good worship playlist with a lot of songs. It'll um, satisfy you for up to probably 7 hours if you need it. But there's a great song in that called Nobody that highlights how, compared to Jesus, we are nobody because he came down on this earth. And like he talks about later, that we'll get to, he fulfills this law, right? The only one who can do it. And so if he can come down and be humble and be this servant, then who are we to think that we're somebody when in reality we are nobody, right? I think that that's a big thing if you want to add to that, like me and you, and especially like the amount of people that look to us, and you know, every day we're taught to like promote ourselves. So
Yeah, that was a nice little plug with our Apple Music too, by the way.
yeah, try
But
to throw that in there. It's a
that
good.
kind of got me to think about what Dakota said last night at the point. Kind of surround yourself with like a godly community. Um, he said, kind of the pure in heart, the people who you're around can make it so much easier to turn to God in times of struggle, but they can also make God seem invisible, like you're not the God you should be hanging around.
Hmm.
And you were kind of talking about like the kind of people that we want to be, and like we kind of have this big, not like a target on our back, but that we're like Division 1 athletes at a pretty big school, and people just look to us first, and it's we're kind of just we're out there for God and trying to show people how to live the good Christian life. Like you can be a big time athlete, and like you see what Ohio State did. They're all big time athletes,
Yeah,
and they put God first. That's that's how you do it.
yeah, and I think like you said, there's a lot of eyes on us, so it's like, are we giving glory to God for where we are, or are we kind of being prideful and saying that it's all ourselves? And I think that we'll get to it in verse 13 about kind of that way of the opportunities we have, but in he ends his sermon, or he ends not his sermon, but the Beatitudes. He ends with um, a little bit of what we talked about last week, kind of in how like letting us know like we will suffer and be mocked. And I think that every day we see that now. It's way differently than they were mocked and they were persecuted and suffered back in the day. But I think that last week we talked about in the narrow gate, we should be glad when we're mocked. And he says it here, right? Be happy about it, be very glad, because a great reward awaits you in heaven. And remember, the ancient prophets were persecuted in the same way. And I think it's that thing of he's saying like all these things that like, these characteristics like we talked about, but at the end of the day, like that doesn't mean that your life's going to be easy. But then he says himself that the reward waits for you. So if you can do all these things and live for him, knowing that knowing that's not an easy life, then that reward will come.
Yeah, I remember this from a. It was either the Point or the New Vision Church said it. When you're like being mocked or you're in some like depression or something like that, it's how you get out of that and how you choose to live through that kind of shows who you are the best way. Because when you're happy and everything's going well, it's easy to praise God and glorify Him. But when you're struggling and things aren't going your way, it's kind of like the story of Job. You look at him and he praised God in his struggle, and even when he was doing well, he praised God, and God never left him, and everything turned out all right. So,
Yeah. I think to add that and just kind of like I call it like the wilderness. I did a Bible plan on the Bible app, I think a couple years ago over the summer. And it was kind of talking about like they called it the wilderness and how like there's whenever you're asking like God, where are you? Is those times where he's there with you, and if you need him and you reach out your hand, he's gonna be there. But it's those things of the analogy of kind of comparing it to growing up with your parents, right? Like he lets you go and deal with some things, and you're going to be tested through these trials, um because at the end of it you're going to be stronger, right? And it's kind of like a baby, like growing up. If you're babied by your parents your whole life and then you go out on your own, you're not going to know what to do. And it's the same thing, like as God is our father, like he's there with us every step of the way, but he lets us kind of go and see what we do and rely on him still. But knowing that if he babies us the whole way, makes everything look perfect for us, then the one sign of being thrown off, then you're done for, right? You don't know how to endure it through him. But yeah, but this is for for me, going into verse 13 when it talks teaching about salt and light. This is a big one for me, because it starts off in verse 13 by saying you're the salt of the earth, but what good is salt if it has lost its flavor? Can you make it salty again? It will be thrown out and trampled underfoot as worthless. And I think the question is like, what good is food if you don't eat it? It's a waste of money. If I go to the store and get milk and leave it in the fridge and don't open it, don't drink it, don't break that seal, it's going to be worthless and it's going to be a waste of money. So it's, Jesus paid the price for us, and he hasn't yet as he's given this sermon, but it's that thing of like, don't waste the gifts God's given to us, I think is the biggest thing. Um, and that's one thing that was so big for me looking at this is I think growing up, I've always been like the a good Christian man of reading my Bible maybe and praying and doing the things, but for myself. But I never until sophomore year, I think, of college really like stepped outside my comfort zone and used my gift of talking a lot, or even just like being in a big stage. Yeah, talking a lot is what I do. That's kind of why I started this. But whether it's speaking or art, sports, school, whatever it is, like God's given you these gifts to spread the good news of the kingdom. And I think that a lot of people, they hide these gifts, right? And there's so many ways to do it. But yeah, before I get into more about the lamp and whatnot, if you have anything to add about that, but
yeah, I think with the salt and light, us as Christians, we are called the salt and the light of the earth. And if we lose our faith for the salt and the light, then what good are we in the world? I think that's why it's so important we do good works in God's name, because those who are in darkness will see God through our light, and we can light up a dark room with our faith and good works.
yeah. And I like the lamp analogy that Jesus uses, right? And obviously, he says, we're the light of the world, which is just awesome to hear. Because after all of our sins, our struggles, and our downfalls, and all he that has happened, that is happening when he's given this, and that he knows will happen in the future, and he still calls us the light of the world is pretty crazy. Because no human could ever, be that forgiving of those sins.
It's a lot of love for sure.
Yeah, it's a lot of love. But we're called not to hide this light, but to put it up high so the light reaches all those around us, right? I think that's a perfect analogy of lighting the whole room around you, because you can turn your light on and put it under a table and use it for yourself. But at the end of the day, like we talked about in the Great Commission, at the end of Matthew and all the Gospels, where Jesus is telling them, go out and be disciples of me, spread the word. He's saying like, go put your light on top of the mountain, on top of the nightstand, so everyone else can be lit up by this light. Um,
Yeah, that kind of makes me think about one day I was in the student union or something, and uh, this guy came up to me, and he was handing out these little like worship cards, and he was telling us kind of about his story and his worship, and that got me thinking when he said being disciple of Christ. Him going out and just talking to random people, getting them to try to gather and come to his worship night. Like that's being a disciple of Christ. Like we think, oh, we just go to church Sunday and we'll pray every now and then. Yeah, I'm doing my job. I'm doing good enough. But
yeah, it's tough.
it's it's courageous. It took a lot of courage for him to go out and talk to random people because who knows what they're going to say to you. But that just kind of that thing just kind of inspires me to kind of do more than what I'm like just comfortable with.
Yeah, and like that's a perfect example too. And it's tough. Like even like I know like people that know me and like I like to talk to people, but it's still like, and I don't think like you immediately think like you read that and you think, well, I gotta go tell everybody the whole world. Like it's not like that. You can start small and it makes you more comfortable, right? Like whenever you have to get out of your comfort zone and you start with just like your house and your brother, your sister, your parents, right? And then once you gather that group of people, like we have a Bible study here at MTSU, and at first it starts small, but once you have that comfort and you have that faith growing, and you have all these people, it feels way better to send out a message to these people, hey, like come here and attend, or whatever, we're doing this thing, and you have that backing, right? Like you don't have to start by telling the whole world and going to hand out flyers on a campus, but you can start by just talking to people around you, and then that grows and grows on. And I think that when we are this light, however, when you go do these things, right, it's all through God. Again, it's not yourself. And he talks about that in Matthew 6 that we'll get to next week. But I think one of the biggest things that I have is like to be able to be the light of this world, we must be plugged in to the outlet, right? Like we can't be a light on our own. And I think God's our outlet, and He's our source of light and our source of energy, and He gives us light. Without Him, we're dark, right? And without being plugged into that wall, which is Jesus and God, like then we have no light, and we're kind of on our own. But we need to be plugged into that outlet, and I think that that's just something that I thought about in that way is like we need to be light to this world, but you can't be a light without using God as your foundation. Yeah, and then moving on to the law. This is I feel like the law is a tough topic, because like is it relevant now? Is it needed now, or is it not? Right, and that's a question that everyone asks, and I think it's a little two-sided. But Jesus kind of makes sure here that people knows that He didn't come to abolish the law. Like the law still has meaning, um, but He came to fulfill it. Like Clay was talking about earlier, He came to kind of show how to live a life that fulfills the law, which none of us could fulfill the law and live perfect through that law except Jesus. And again, like we talked about, He still was a servant, even though He came down here and was perfect. And some of us still think that we can do all these things without Him, which is impressive. Um, but yeah, I know you have a lot on the law, which is pretty. It's a pretty tough subject. But He embodies the law. Nobody else has ever will be able to complete or obey the law like He did. So I think that we were talking. My roommate listens to Joby Martin a lot, a good guy, and I don't know if you saw some in the cover photo or not, but he talked about how this is a new Bible, so this is pretty big. You guys should feel pretty good about I'm doing this, but he talked about how Joby Martin says a lot of people use the law like this as binoculars, and they should be using it like this as a mirror, right? Looking at yourself, because though the law doesn't determine our salvation, it does show us our sin, right? And it shows us, what is a sin and what we should still strive not to do um, on this earth to live like Christ. So, but yeah, if you guys think about it that way, and it talks about it later, right? In the Pharisees, as Jesus says, the Pharisees, he used them as an example because they were very strict on the law, but they didn't have a change of heart for the Lord. And right, so Pharisees are walking around like this. Dude, this is a new Bible too. They're walking around like this, looking at people with binoculars, passing judgment from the law, but then they're being hypocrites and weren't actually living by the law. And I think that that's what Jesus is saying here is that the law is important, but a change of heart is what really matters.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of another way of kind of putting it is don't really worry about what other people are doing because you might not be doing very well either. That with like the binoculars, just don't be too hard on other people, I guess, because they need a little mercy too. And instead of like zoning in and just worrying about what everybody else is doing, worry about yourself first, make yourself good, and then you can worry about others, help them along the way once you get to where God needs you to be.
Yeah, like you said, um, it's tough looking at others in judgment. It talks about it in Matthew 7, which we'll get to, but one of the verses, I don't want to say too much, but one of the verses does say, like, how can you point out a little splinter in someone else's eye when you have a log in your own? And I was always told growing up, I have a little brother, and playing baseball, I would always try to help him. Like I would tell him something about his swing, and my dad would be like, "Your swing's not that good. Why are you being? How are you telling him what to do?" And it's the same thing. It's the same thing here that this law is the Pharisees especially use this law to point out and get these sacrifices and get this money from people, and at the end of the day, like there's no heart change in them. They're really just doing it because they feel like they have that power to do it, which is something that goes on a lot today is pointing out somebody else's flaws when you have your own, right? Because you just want to make yourself feel better, which I think is pretty good. But it shows us what is a sin, and like Jesus said, He didn't come to abolish it. It's not irrelevant. We talked about it some in episode 1. It's important, but that's not how our salvation's gained. So yeah, and then moving into anger, it's just I think one thing that's just as you go on in the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus is talking to these people 2,000 years ago, and this stuff still so very easily applies to us. I don't know what you think about that, but it's just like with the technology we have and the life that we live is that's so different than what they lived. We still are like it applies directly to what we're living right now.
Yeah, I think I listened on a different podcast. Somebody said that this book never expires. Like it's good. It was good 2,000 years ago, and it's still good today.
Yeah, maybe you taught me about that. But it starts off. He starts off kind of harsh, right? And says, "You've heard that our ancestors were told you must not murder. If you commit murder, you are subject to judgment. But I say, even if you are angry with someone, you are subject to judgment." And it goes on to talk about when you curse someone or call someone an idiot, which I do a lot actually. And I call myself an idiot a lot too, but that's another time. But that's kind of we're little side note. We are made wonderfully and fearfully made in the image of God. So it's that same thing of when we talk bad about ourselves, we're really we're sinning against God because He created us beautifully, and we're kind of cursing His creation. But it starts off harsh if you look at that and glance over it. But at the end of the day, in the eyes of God, yes, like anger, murder, all sins are the same, right? So even though based on the worldly law, which is still good to follow, um, you don't want to go to jail or nothing. But anger and sin and lust and all these things are the same punishment in God's eyes, the same judgment in God's eyes. Um, and I think that one thing I gathered from this, though, is that anger leads to all of these things if you can't control it and have that self control. Like, at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to, like, not get angry. I think that is a good way to put it. Um, I think that, yes, you're going to be angry a lot, but it's really how you act on it. I think it's the way.
Yeah, it's every day. It's a struggle.
Yeah.
because even the little things that you just think in your mind, if you think like just bad about somebody, like yeah, you're not really supposed to do that. Even though you didn't act on it or say anything, it's it's just an impure thought, and it's not what God wants you to be doing. But
Yeah. I think it's just like awareness, right? Like we talked about that in um some sports psychologist the other day about like how awareness is a big deal and just first recognizing the problem. And I think that same goes for years. Awareness in ourselves to recognize the anger and not let it stay in our hearts and not hold these grudges, right? Because all throughout this text 21 to verse 21 to 26, he talks again, and he says don't hold grudges. Like if you're going to sacrifice an animal with a grudge in your mind, go like let that off before you sacrifice that animal. And I think that having that awareness, like you said, and the same thing goes for lust later on, and vows and revenge and all these things that pop into your mind. I think having that awareness is what really um, kind of allows you to take that next step. And again, some of that's just knowing the law and knowing Jesus. But we won't be free until we've paid the last penny, like he says in verse 26. I think that if like you said, yeah, you have that thought, and no matter what you do, yes, those thoughts might go down of whatever it is, but at the end of the day, like we're
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 human.
human.
It's gonna happen.
Yeah,
You're gonna slip up every now and then, and the best thing to do about it is just pray about it consistently and just ask God for guidance, wisdom, and His patience with you, because it's gonna happen again and again and again.
yeah. You just gotta pray and confess. And it sounds silly, kind of too, like God, I'm sorry I thought about this anger or I cursed this person out in my brain, but at the end of the day, it's what you have to do and confess. And that leads straight into adultery, right? Which is lust. And as men, especially for men in today's world, this is one of the most relevant things because I feel like it's so normalized nowadays. Just lust and the sexual desire and things like that. But I think it's so um, relevant nowadays and how it's become so normal and it's hard to avoid. Like whether like you just get on your phone or you're walking around campus or walking down the street, like it's really hard to avoid just the way that the world is right now. But that doesn't mean that it's okay. I guess is the thing, right? Because I feel like nowadays people try to use the Bible and manipulate it into how the world is. But like you said, this is doesn't have a time period. It doesn't go extinct. Like it literally is changing with like it stays the same. It's not changing. It stays the same and is the same throughout the whole.
Yeah, the words may change a little bit, but the message is it's still there.
There you go. Yeah, I couldn't get it out of my mouth. Whatever. But yeah, I think that yeah, just lust is a big thing, especially for men and for women too. But for men, especially our age, I think it's a big thing. And
Yeah, I think especially men our age and where we're at in our life, like we're playing college sports, and you may think like college athletes, oh, you probably get all these girls talking to you and all that
well,
stuff,
I know you do, but I
oh,
don't.
right.
Yeah, I mean,
But I don't know, it's uncomfortable to talk about, honestly. Um, but
yeah, it is, but it's
um,
something that you have to kind of address. And I think the best way, and we've talked about this plenty of times in our Bible study, and in verse 29 and 30, Jesus says, "Tear out your eye if it causes you to lust, and cut off your limb, right, your arm or your leg if it causes you to lust." And I mean, if you want, I guess I'm not encouraging you, but you can do that. But I think that every person in the world would have no arms, no legs, and no eyes. I think if that was honestly, but I think that we've talked about plenty of times. It starts at what you look at on your phone, right? You have to create that habit. Um, and like before you go to bed, when you wake up, like what are you looking at, right? Because it influences you. Like before you do anything in the morning, like in my opinion, I think that like and this is just habit for me now. Before I go to bed, I pray and I get into the Word a little bit. But when I wake up too, like I think that if you pray and you get into the Word, and before you look at anything else, your phone or whatever it is, I think that you're going to see a big change in how your life goes and your view of the world, which I think is a big thing. And that's kind of what, you know, I think I go in spurts, and my house especially, we go in spurts of trying to like help each other out and like, hey, like when you get up, see how long you can go without getting on your phone. Like, read, make breakfast, listen to podcasts, listen to some music, whatever it is. And again, too, music. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, if you are on your phone, make it like worthwhile. Don't
yeah,
just be scrolling on social media. Like I know I have what I do in the morning. I kind of listen to it's called Bible in a Year podcast. It's by Father Mike Schmitz, and it's on the Ascension app on your phone. And it's probably just 30 minutes when I wake up in the morning. I just listen to a chapter or two in a couple books in the Bible, and it's I might listen to it on the way to a class or just walking throughout campus. It's just a nice way to, yeah, I'm on my phone, but I don't know, I'm trying to better myself and just trying to get to know the Lord a lot better.
yeah, and that's perfect. I think it's like you said, it kind of brings that peace, but you'll just see the changes in your mind, and your thoughts. It's like we said, you might not act on any of these thoughts, but even the thoughts that come to your mind will be different, will be more pure and of heart. And I think that from experience in both of us, I think that we'll say that. And another thing that we'll say too is I think it is the way that as a man, the way you talk to or look at women is, if your first thought is some lustful thought, I think that it's the words of like, for me, like, I don't like hot and pretty are two different things. And I think that hot is a way of the world. And I think pretty, you're right, or beautiful is a way like a God has made us to, look at these things. Like we don't call the sunset hot, right? I don't know. That's a funny thing, but I think that when we look at a sunset, right, we say like, wow, that's a pretty sunset. That's beautiful. And God created that. Well, God created every human on earth. And so I think it's the same thing of, when you look at someone and you see these things, whatever it may be, it's like, wow, that's God's creation, right? Like, she's pretty, he's very handsome, um,
Yeah,
those things, and not like, wow, like she's hot. And I think that's, I don't know. I think that too. Again, it's like kind of catching yourself, and that's awareness. At the end of the day, I think a lot of what you talk about right here is awareness and knowing these things, because thoughts are going to pop into your mind no matter what at some point, and it's just knowing how to act on those and getting the word.
yeah. I'll hear some of our buddies or my buddies back home or something like, "Oh, dude, look at that girl. She's hot." And they're like, that just kind of gives me the ick now. And
I know.
I'm like, she's one of like she's God's child. Like
Yeah,
she's a child of God, and it just feels weird to call her just hot.
yeah, I agree.
It's like she was like gorgeous or beautiful. And kind of keep in mind like just your vocabulary that you're using, because I think it goes a long way. I think women appreciate that more, and especially if they're a woman of God, I think they'll appreciate that
Yeah,
a lot better.
I just thought I think if you are going to take anything, I think that you should talk about other people in this world, whether it be man or woman, the way that you would talk about a sunset. I think that's a great thing.
That's a good way to put
That's a
it.
good way to put it. I don't know, because I'm not calling a sunset hot or or sexy or nothing.
That's a sexy
That's
sunset.
a sexy sunset. We might start that. I don't know, but no, but I think at the end of the day, all right, you got to be different than the world. Don't follow the world just because they deem it acceptable, because there's a lot of things that are acceptable that are very questionable.
Yeah,
So
you don't want to fall into worldly things, desires. That's going straight downhill.
yeah,
No good.
hmm yeah. The next thing's about teaching about divorce, right? And I think for us, we're not married men, not yet at least. I think that when you look at divorce, really quickly, if there's no reason for divorce, other than like you just fell out of love, then I think that it's the wrong thing. I think there's reasons that it for divorce, like it says, if she's unfaithful or she's committed adultery, but I think that at the end of the day, it's something that you can work through God, right? And I think if um like we said, we're not experienced, but I think at the end of the day, if your marriage and your relationship has a foundation of Jesus and God at the forefront, and I think that that that'll go a long way, and you won't find yourself in this problem.
Yeah, for sure. You kind of you look at like the triangle. It's like the man and wife, and at the top is God. It's like if your relationship has a foundation of God, then there's really there should be no worry about divorce or committing adultery or anything like that, because you're both you're with Christ and He's with you guys. And, it just I feel like that isn't a worry in a
Yeah, it's
Christ-centered
not. And you
relationship.
hold each other accountable too,
Yeah,
for things, because like you said, it's not a perfect marriage at the end of the day. Um, but yeah, that's all we have on that. Like you said, we're not very informed on that as much. Maybe give us a couple years, we'll check back with you guys on how we're living. But the next thing is teaching about vows, right? And like this whole thing's a teaching, but it's just funny nowadays that like I think the biggest thing it says is like don't make a vow because we have no certainty that we can come through on that promise. And like it says here, don't swear by anything, don't promise, don't just all you got to say is yes I will or no I won't. Anything beyond that is from the evil one. In Matthew 5:36 and 37. But I think that like you said, nowadays it's natural, like, I swear to God, or on God, or like, oh, I promise you I'm going to do this, right? Like if you ask me to do something, like I want to do it for you, but I'll just say like, yeah, I got you, like, yes, right? Because at the end of the day, like it says in verse 36, like we have no idea if we can truly follow through. God's the only one who makes promises with us that will fulfill that promise and stand on that promise. It's like it says, do not even say by my head, for you can't turn one hair white or black on your head, right? Like we have no control. Yes, like we can do these things, but at the end of the day, like we have no control over what happens. End of the day. Well, yeah, I think nowadays it's just so easy to be like, "Yep, dude, I promise you I'm gonna do it. I swear I'm gonna do it," and then it's like, "Well, I didn't do that." So
yeah. I'll say yes to somebody in the locker room or something. I'll turn the corner. I'll forget what they said already.
it's something taken. Like again, I think all these things are taken so lightly, and it's become so normal that it's like, "Oh, it's not that bad." Which, like, again, like if you do it, you confess your sin, and like, it's gonna happen. Like, I'm probably going to tell someone tomorrow, like, "Yeah, I promise you," or something, but. It's just where you have to be aware, again, awareness, and
Yeah,
confess your sin and do that thing. So yeah, but I don't know. I think nowadays it's just all the time. It's um, so easy to do these things. And the crazy part is people will still lie when they say like, "Dude, I did this. I swear to God," and they still are lying. Like that's pretty crazy. Normally, when that's why like when you play like Mafia on the bus, though, that's why you're not allowed to say that because then they're telling the truth most of the time.
yeah. That one breaks some barriers for sure.
Yeah. And again, talking about revenge, moving into 38 and on, when Jesus teaches about revenge right here, again, it's a thing in this world that is very relevant. And it's human nature to want revenge. Um, and I think that, Jesus here, the law, it says, you have heard the law that says the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. If you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. Give those who ask, and don't turn away from those who want to borrow. It's cheesy, but the kill 'em with kindness is the thing that I've always been taught, and it's brought up many times in our Bible study and all these things. It's just human nature to want to get back at somebody and have the upper hand, but like Jesus says here, like, what good does that do?
Yeah, it's like you said, it's not easy. If somebody treats me poorly, that my first thought is definitely not to.
Like, I'm gonna get
Uh,
them back.
yeah, I'm gonna get them back. But yeah, in mine it says if like they force you to go 1 mile, you go with them two. You kind of do it extra. You kill them with kindness a little extra, just so not so that they feel bad, but so that they can maybe see how you're living, and
You're a man of God,
that
or a person of God.
yeah, that they would want some part of that too is the hope.
Yeah, I think is a big thing because like you said, we're gonna get persecuted, and when you step outside your comfort zone and try to be a lamp on a night or on top of a stand for everybody else, um, you're gonna be turned down, right? Like I'm sure that that person you talked about that came up to you, he was turned down, right? And what if he just was like, "No, take this," and threw it at him, or tried to get back at him and was like, "Oh, I'll get you," right? Like
Yeah, it just defeats
then
the
it's
whole
gonna be
purpose.
like, yeah, defeats the whole purpose, and it's like, well, that's why should I follow God if that's how they're gonna act towards
Yeah,
me. So I think that yeah, like it defeats the whole purpose, and if you ask somebody like, "Hey, come to my Bible study, how about you try it out?" and they're like, "No," and you're like, "Well, screw you," and you curse them out, and you're like, "Well, like you suck," and all these things, then
that's not gonna make
that's
them.
yeah, that's not
That's
gonna
not
make
gonna
them
make them
want
want
to
to go.
go. But if you're like, "Hey, all right, but if you ever need anything, or if you feel like you have any questions, like let me know," and they're gonna walk away like, "Wow, I just turned them down, and they still like showed that love towards me,"
Yeah,
um, which literally brings us into the last little bit of chapter 5, um, loving your enemies. So I think yeah, it's pretty.
it's probably one of the hardest things to do. I think.
Yeah, I think prayer, like Jesus says in this, pray for those who persecute you, and in that way you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. Because he gives sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust. So I think you grow up, and it's like love your neighbor, love your enemies as well, and I think that that's the tough thing, especially as a competitive mindset. Not saying that like wanting to beat somebody in something that you're doing is a bad thing, right? Like whether it's just a board game or a sports game or trying to outcompete. I don't think competing is a bad thing. It's something that God's allowed us to, have a when we have a passion for something. But I think that loving your enemy is, like you said, is a tough subject because some people do some pretty bad things. But at the end of the day, if you look at it, like yes, I love God and we have a relationship with God, but like we're not enemies, but we have betrayed him and disobeyed him plenty of times, and he still loves us unconditionally. And so like we're called to do the same thing, which is tough. But if someone wrongs me, like you said, first reaction, human reaction, is to get back at them.
Yeah,
But
I think kind of what you just said. I think God can be one of our greatest teachers in loving your enemies. I know we're not His enemy, obviously, but how many times a day do we wrong Him, and He still shows us love, and He doesn't like persecute us or anything. But it's kind of God loves us so much. Why can't we love somebody who just calls us a bad name or does something so small in the grand scheme of things?
yeah, I think uh, yeah, that's a good that's a good way to put it. Because yeah, Jesus came down and was an example for us, and we've talked about it before, but he was fully God, fully man as well. So he could have snapped his fingers and done anything, and he came down here and he was a servant to everybody. But he was an example of how to love, right? Because people wronged him plenty of times, and I mean, he was on that cross, and he could have gotten back at all those people plenty of times, but he still loved his enemies. He still prayed for them and was like, "Lord, they don't know what they do. Please, please forgive them." And that's just something that we'll never be able to live like that because of our sinful nature. But every day, if you have this awareness, you do these things. You get in the Word, you pray to the Lord. I think prayer is something that we take for granted as well, and just talking to Him and having that connection with Him. I think that that's a big thing, and it'll just teach you more and more to kind of love your enemies, and um, like it says, you show favoritism towards somebody. If you're only kind to your friends, how are you different from anybody else, right? And like we said, we're called to be different. Like the world says, like hate these people that are against you and hate these people who persecute you, right? It's like, well, if these guys, I think that's one thing that people look at, good, genuine, like Christians and good people is like that guy just wronged you. Like, how do you just sit there and like smile, right? And it's like I got God. Like
Yeah,
you got to be different, and that it'll stand out when you're different. It's like you said. Like Jesus ends in chapter 5, you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect.
Yeah.
We'll never get there, um, but we should strive every day to be perfect, even though knowing that we won't get there. But I guess every time you pray and confess your sins, your slate's washed clean, and you were technically perfect in God's eyes for that time being until we're bound to sin again. But
Yeah, it's really good stuff.
really good stuff. Next week we'll get into chapter 6. Then next we'll get into chapter 7. This is a 3-part series. Hopefully we'll have Clay next week, but trying to get a lot of people on and working in here. But thanks for watching, and hope you like what you listened to and tune into this series we're doing about the Sermon on the Mount.